In this lesson, we'll multiply by powers of 10. Well, to start off, when we're multiplying times 1, remember that any number times 1 is that number itself. So 1 times $45.75 will be $45.75. But when we multiply $45.75 times 10, we have to remember that when we multiply a number times 10, we're increasing its value, or each digit's value, I should say, by one place value column greater, since our place value system is based on powers of 10. 10 represents one place value column, so we'll move the decimal one time to the right in order to move all of our digits to the next higher place value column. For example, the 4 right now here is in the tens place. When we move the decimal one time, it would become a 4 in the hundredths place. The 5 would follow in the tens. The 7 would be in the ones place, with the decimal now right here behind the 7. Because this is a money amount, or we need to add a 0 here to make it $457.50. If there was no dollar sign and this did not represent money, we would not add that 0 at the end. In this one, we're multiplying times 100. 100 is the same as 10 times 10, which would represent 2 place value columns, as these 2 zeros signify. So we're going to move the decimal 2 times to the right. The decimal's now behind this last 5. When the decimal comes at the end of a number, the number becomes a whole number. Since there's nothing to go behind the decimal point here, we would just leave that decimal point off and leave it as $4,575. When we're multiplying times 1,000, we can keep in mind that 1,000 is the same as 10 times 10 times 10, representing 3 place value columns, as the 3 zeros would show us. So this time we will have to move the decimal 3 times to the right. This empty space will be filled in with a 0, and the decimal is behind that last 0. So again, we would have a whole number, $45,750. When we look at something like this next example with whole numbers, this is something you can answer these without giving thought to where the decimal is. But we're going to go through and think of it in terms of the decimal point and moving that decimal point to get our products. 1 times 2 is 2. 10 times 2, I know you know, is 20, but let's think about it as we did this first example here. 2 is a whole number, so it doesn't have a decimal in it in its whole number form. So if we add a decimal to a whole number, the decimal would go behind it. Since we're multiplying times 10, we're going to move the decimal one time to the right, adding a 0 in the empty spot, which would give us 20, which I know you know would be the answer to 10 times 2. We know that 100 times 2 is 200, but again, let's think about it in the terms of a decimal. Since we're multiplying times 100, we're moving the decimal 2 times to the right. Again, the decimal starts in the back. We move the decimal to the right 2 times, add 2 zeros in the empty spots, and the product would then be 200. When we're multiplying times 1,000, we're going to move the decimal 3 times, as these 3 zeros show us to represent 3 place value columns. The decimal starts behind the 2, since the 2 is a whole number. And we move the decimal 3 times to the right, adding 3 zeros in those empty spots, and the product would then be 2,000. If we continue on to these, it's the same idea as the first page. Now, though, the values of 10 are listed with exponents. So what we have to keep in mind is when we have a number with an exponent of 0, we have to know that any number, we can kind of make a note of this, to the power of 0 equals 1. So whether it's 10 to the power of 0, 9 to the power of 0, 137 to the power of 0, it's always going to equal 1. So we know 1 times any number is that number, so 10 to the power of 0 times 3 7/10 is going to equal 3 7/10. The number doesn't change. Now 10 to the power of 1 means 10. So 10 times 3 7/10 tells us we have to move the decimal 1 time to the right. The decimal's now behind the 7, so our answer would be 37. Again, the decimal ends up behind the last digit. If it ends up behind the last digit with nothing behind it, we drop that decimal off. 10 to the power of 2 is the same as saying 10 times 10, or we can think of that as 100, which represents 2 place value columns. The 2 zeros represent 2 place value columns as noted by the exponent. So we move the decimal to the right 2 times. We have 1 empty spot to fill in a 0, so the product would be 370. 10 to the power of 3 times 3 7/10. 10 to the power of 3 is the same as 10 times 10 times 10, or that would be 1,000. Those 3 zeros would tell us to move the decimal 3 times, just like the exponent tells us. So we move the decimal to the right 3 times. And we add 2 zeros into the 2 empty decimal places, or place value columns. So the product is 3,700. Again, in this problem, 40 is a whole number, just like we had an example a moment ago where there was no decimal in the number to start. So keeping that in mind, we know 40 is a whole number. The decimal would go behind it. But since 10 to the power of 0 equals 1, this is like multiplying 40 times 1. 40 times 1 is 40. When we come to the second line, 40 times 10 to the power of 1. This power of 1 tells us we have to move the decimal to the right 1 time. So since this is a whole number and the decimal starts behind it, we move it to the right once. We have 1 empty spot, so the product would be 400. When we multiply 40 times 10 to the power of 2, we're moving the decimal 2 times to the right. So we add 2 zeros in those empty spots, and it gives us a product of 4,000. In the last section, we're multiplying times 10 to the power of 3, which tells us we have to move the decimal to the right 3 times. We have 3 empty places, so we add 3 zeros into those empty places to give us the product of 40,000. In all the examples we've worked so far, we're multiplying times 10, well, starting with 1, but after that, 10, 100, and 1,000. Those would all represent higher place value columns. So we move the decimal to the right to move all of our digits into higher place values and to make our products larger. In these next examples, notice we're multiplying by powers of 10 again, but these are decimal numbers that we're multiplying by. We're multiplying times, after times 1, it's times 1/10 and times 1/100th. And from, let's start with these, sorry. From what we learned in the last chapter, when we're taking 1/10 of a number, the number's getting smaller. Each digit would have to go to a smaller place value column. So instead of moving the decimal to the right, in these we're going to move the decimal to the left. So when we're multiplying times a decimal power of 10, we're going to move the decimal to the left. Well, here in 38 times 1, we know that number stays the same. That's 38. But here in 38 times 1/10, 38 is a whole number, so the decimal, we have to remember the decimal starts behind a whole number. We're multiplying it times 1/10, which is the first place behind the decimal. It's 1 place behind the decimal, so we move the decimal 1 place to the left. So the decimal is now between the 3 and the 8, and it's 3 8/10. And you notice each of these digits in the original number 38 have moved to smaller place value columns. The 8 was in the 1's place, it's now in the 10's place. The 3 was in the 10's place, now it's in the 1's place. So we were successful there. In this example, we're multiplying times 100th. 100th is the second place behind the decimal, so that means we need to move the decimal, which starts here, 2 times to the left. The second decimal place, see 2 decimal places here, represent 2 places we're going to move the decimal. But this time, remember, we're going to the left. The decimal ends up in front of the 3, so we have 38 hundredths. The 0 in front of the decimal is optional. You can put it, since that's what the book puts and that's what you're used to seeing, but it's also okay to leave the 0 off. In these next sets, we're multiplying 8 times, first of all, 1, which we know is 8, then 8 times 1/10. So we have to know where to place the decimal. Remember, that's behind a whole number. 1/10 is in the first decimal place behind the decimal point. So we're moving the decimal only one time to the left. So the decimal is now in front of the 8. So we have 8/10. When we multiply 8 times 1/100th, the decimal again starts right behind that whole number. We have 2 decimal places. So we're going to move the decimal 2 times to the left. And the product would then be 8/100ths, adding a 0 there, if you'd like. We have 2 more sets, but if you notice in this one, the decimal is already in place in this factor. 6 1/10 times 1 is 6 1/10. Now when we multiply 6 1/10 times 1/10, the decimal is already here, so we're moving this decimal one place to the left. Remember, 1 decimal place here, move the decimal 1 time to the left. The decimal's in front of the 6. Our product is 60/100ths. When we're multiplying times 100th, we have the 2 decimal places, so we're going to move the decimal 2 times to the left, adding a 0 in the empty place. So we now have 61/1000ths. 1 times 682 is 682. 1/10 times 682 means we have to move the decimal 1 time to the left. 682 is a whole number, so the decimal starts at the back. We move it one place to the left. The decimal is now between the 8 and the 2, so we have 68 2/10. In the last example, we're multiplying times 100th. The 2 decimal places means we're moving the decimal 2 times to the left. So the decimal is now between the 6 and the 8, so it's 6 82/100ths.